understand we just published a book.
Okay, so welcome to this seminar on China's role in international relations and the prospect of closer cooperation between China and Europe in a new geopolitical setting. My name is Pernille Riker. I'm a research professor here at NUPI and also director of Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo, Arena. And this seminar is part of a project that we have on called Norway and the EU in changing times. So it's but today we will not talk so much about Norway, but we will talk about China, but also China-EU relations. And the title of today's seminar is maybe a bit provocative to some in in the audience. I don't know. We will see. A normative China and a geopolitical Europe have the roles been reversed. And I think that most of us will agree that Europe has become more geopolitical. And then the question is China becoming more normative? And that we look very much forward to hearing about this. But of course, we are living in a time where roles are changing. We see a transformed U.S. foreign policy under Trump 2.0. And the question is how other global actors can and should react. Global power dynamic shifts and the rules of international engagement are rewritten. The understanding of China's evolving role is, of course, crucial. How is China responding to a changing world order, and what does it mean for the rest of us, especially Europe, including Norway, of course? So we are very pleased to have Associate Professor Reuben Wong from the National University of Singapore here with us today to explain to us China's strategies, ambitions, and behaviours on the global stage. This seminar will examine the challenges and opportunities facing China in this new context, and we are particularly interested in how China recalibrating its approach to the European Union, but also United States, Russia, and its Asian neighbours. So, Reuben Wong, you are very well placed to give us an Asian perspective on these issues, as you're working in Singapore as a deputy head and associate professor at the Department for Political Science at the National University of Singapore. I would just inform you all that this seminar will be streamed, so you're aware of that. And so welcome to Reuben Wong, and with no further ado, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. In fact, I was supposed to be here at NUPI last year in March, and then I missed my flight. So the lesson is arrive the day before and don't go through London Heathrow if possible. But this is my third time in Oslo, and I appreciate the warmth and the hospitality given by NUPI and by Arena as well, the University of Oslo. The topic I'm going to address today is I realize it's being streamed, so I'm going to be a little bit more careful than usual, since it's not really Chatham House rules. But what I want to offer are some perspectives from Singapore, for myself, as a watcher of both the EU and China. Much of my research has been on the EU's relations with China and the EU's foreign policy towards this part of the world, East Asia. In fact, I spent my first career as a diplomat in Paris, in the Singapore embassy, and that's when I started this interest in the EU's relations with China, because I realized that the French were saying very interesting things about the rise of China and about, geopolitical shifts. This was in the 1990s. And they, I felt, were among the few European states which were preparing for the rise of China. One of the things that shocked me at the time was how the French went against the European norm of criticizing China at the UN based on its human rights record. And they, together with some other countries, which at that time were called the Airbus countries, so they were the Airbus consortium, and they had, of course, great economic stakes in China. they decided to take a different tack. And it's a big thing at the time. And I think for me, 1997 marked the beginning of a more assertive Chinese position on human rights. Okay, so let's quickly start now. EU as a serious geopolitical actor, I think, as Pernilla mentioned, and for me as a student of European foreign policy, but based in Asia, I found this amazing that, after 2022, Europe was able to make so many decisions, and key countries within Europe, including Germany, were able to pass legislation and release funds to help arm Ukraine. For those of you who are familiar with European foreign policy, 1991, 1992, with the start of the European Union, Maastricht Treaty, there were big pronouncements about this is the hour of Europe. This is the hour of Europe, not of the Americans. And if you remember that was the Balkan War. And that was a very, perhaps far-fetched and over-ambitious statement about the ability of European foreign policy to make a geopolitical difference. But as you know, I think it was within 24 hours that short truce brokered by the European Union broke down, and basically we had a very, very bloody war, and probably the first genocide in Europe since the Holocaust. Another time the European foreign policy looked set to take off, I think, was the St. Malo Agreement. Although those of you who are familiar with Britain and France would know that there are two bedfellows but with different dreams. I think that's both an English and a Chinese proverb. The Chinese version is sleeping in the same bed but having different dreams. And of course the French and British had different ideas about what an independent European foreign policy would entail. The French thinking that it should be independent of the US, independent of NATO as far as possible, and the British thinking that it must be completely consistent with NATO and consistent with American interests. So I remember lots and lots of conferences, I attended so many where they talked about formation of different brigades and was it 60,000 rapid reaction force, about to have a proper 60,000 reaction force that you needed 180,000 troops because you had to rotate them. And I thought, wow, this is finally happening, a geopolitical Europe. But then it lost steam. And then in the 2010s, you've had several issues with Russia, say with the Georgian incursion, and then with Crimea, and finally 2022, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So for me, watching this since the 1990s, whether as a diplomat or as a scholar, I found it amazing that Europe was slowly but suddenly becoming a geopolitical actor. So I think there is no, or maybe there might be some other disagreement, because one of my best friends in London, Karen Smith, who is a professor in the LSE, she feels, she's American by the way, she feels that Europe's vocation is not to be a geopolitical or military actor. Europe should just stand for norms, human rights, democracy promotion. Finally, second point is China as a rising power, and China as a power which is able to advance alternative norms. I think yesterday when I presented at Arena in the University of Oslo, I got a lot of pushback, but I guess that's normal. So every time I say something about China as a normative power, people straight away push back. China is not normative power. China is a kind of a geopolitical player. It's a strategic diplomatic power, but is by no means a normative power. Here I want to say that when I say normative power, I mean a state or an actor that promotes certain norms. Those norms might not be the norms that or liberal norms that people in the West like to hear. I mean, a country like Norway, I guess, for you, norms might mean human rights. And when you say human rights, you mean a particular kind of first-generation liberal norms, democracy promotion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, all the kinds of norms that a certain president in the United States doesn't seem to like. But the Chinese also have a feeling about what norms are important in the world. And I think looking at China in the last 20 or 30 years, we need to be prepared for that. What kinds of norms does China prefer? What kinds of norms is China promoting? And I would suggest three of them. Three which are sovereignty, non-interference, and the right to development. Now, I think most of us are familiar with the first two, although I think sitting from a European perspective, you might say sovereignty is never absolute, right? And sovereignty is a bit passé because we are in a more closely interconnected world. And I think China also understands that. But when China talks about sovereignty, it has a certain background which I guess we in the West might need to be aware of. For them, sovereignty is very absolute because they remember what they call 150 years of shame. Okay. And for those of you who might be a little bit more familiar with Chinese history, starting with the Opium Wars in the 1840s and the cession of territories, right? So the French or British, of course, will be more familiar with them because they were basically the major culprits. You know, they took the port cities in Canton, which is Guangzhou province today. They took Hong Kong, that's probably the most famous. The Portuguese took Macau, that had been a few hundred years before. And with a series of unequal treaties, China and that particular dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, the Qing, fell. I mean, they basically lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Of course, it didn't help that they were not really Chinese. I mean, what I mean is the Qing dynasty was made up of people who were not the Han. They were not the major ethnic Chinese group. So they were already seen as not really Chinese, like the Mongols who had ruled China before. But the fact that they had given up territories, the fact that they had been humiliated by Western powers, and in this case, it's not just Western powers, it also included Japan and Russia, right? And the United States. So for China, there is a very long memory of humiliation by the rest of the world. Of course, for many of you who are familiar with Russia as well, there are similar sentiments, right? The sense that we've been humiliated, we've been invaded, we've had unequal treaties imposed on us. So this, I think, when Mao declared in Tiananmen Square in October 1949, China has stood up. You know, it resonated with Chinese people in China, but also me as an ethnic Chinese person. My grandparents would say Mao was a great leader because he brought kind of a sense of self-respect back to China after 100 years of shame. Secondly is non-interference. This is, I think, a norm which China is very insistent on, but it is a double-edged norm because they insist on non-interference by the foreign and international community in what they see as their affairs, but they are also very insistent on interfering in other countries' affairs, especially in the neighborhood. So this one, I'm not quite sure how the Chinese themselves square it, but you will see that in the statements and in the policies coming out of Beijing. Whenever they feel that the international community, it could be the United Nations, it could be UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, when a statement comes out that puts China in the dock, they will say non-interference. But when they want to build, say, military installations in the South China Sea on disputed territory, and some of you might be aware there are disputed territories claimed by China, but also the Philippines, Vietnam, I think Malaysia, and one more country. Right? So all these territories are issues which all claimant states claim sovereignty. Okay, so quite related, sovereignty and non-interference, but interesting to see how China navigates a norm which cuts both ways, in its favor and against it. And then finally, the right to development. And of course, the right to development is something that you hear coming out from the third world. Right? A lot of developing countries say, well, we are slow in development. We did not industrialize as fast as Europe and the United States. So we have a right to, say, catch up. And we give ourselves more time to pollute the environment, to industrialize. Because you've had your day, you had 200 years of industrialization. We just started 20 years ago. Okay. This is something which, unfortunately, has a resonance in Asia, right? Whether it's China or India or many, many other Asian countries which are still on the path of development, they support this. Okay, and here you can see China also being one of the leaders in promoting this norm, whether it's a sustainability conference or an agreement on climate change. China will be taking this lead. I didn't prepare that many slides. I think the last point I wanted to make is all of these changes, I think, geopolitical changes where Europe is finally becoming more of a geopolitical player. And I would also add, in Asia, most countries in Asia, the European Union is usually dismissed as economic giant, but the military, sorry, what is it? An economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm. So that's not even something that the Asians said. I think it was something that one of the European Commission leaders said, acknowledging that this is how the European Union is perceived in Asia. With the very robust response to Russia's aggression in 2022, I think some minds are being changed. There is a big project. I don't know whether I put Martin Holland, maybe not here. Martin Holland, who is a professor in New Zealand, he's done a multi-year project, I think about 20 years now, tracking the perceptions of Europe in Asia. And it's very interesting that in almost all countries in Asia, the European Union is seen as a unidimensional power, just economic. Only in one or two countries is Europe seen as a potential geopolitical power. Would you be able to guess which country this might be? Which country in Asia perceives the European Union as a potential military and geopolitical power?
Taiwan.
Sorry? Taiwan? Not exactly, no. China. Yeah. Why do you think China perceives the EU as a potential military power?
Maybe it could, I'm sorry, I'm just wondering, maybe it could help China potentially to balance the current American geopolitical endeavors out.
Yes,
I mean, I'm
absolutely.
looking from
Yes.
Chinese perspective.
Yes, absolutely. The Chinese see the European Union as one of their potential geostrategic partners. So if you think that Kissinger was a really great statesman in bringing China in, the Chinese are also very Kissingerian. Well, basically, they love Kissinger, right? And Kissinger went to China on his 100th, I think on his 100th year, just a few months before he passed on. And I was surprised when I saw it, because in Singapore, and I think in the financial hubs of China, say in Shanghai, most people will probably tell you the EU is a unidimensional power. But in Beijing, they see the EU as a potential military power. So I think that is changing minds. I still talk to my former colleagues at the Singapore Foreign Ministry, I'm very careful talking to former colleagues in the Chinese Foreign Ministry because they have to declare if they talk to a foreigner, right? But I will try next month when I go to Beijing. The Chinese, in a sense, project their own self-image onto the European Union. They have an identity which is still not quite fully formed, because at times they think of themselves as a developing country, hence they insist on this, but they also think of themselves as a great power and counterbalance the United States, and hence they look towards Russia sometimes, and they also look towards the European Union as a potential ally. This was such the case that in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, an American China watcher, David Shambo, wrote an article called the Emerging Axis. Some of you might remember this, some of the scholars here. And in this article, he suggested China and the EU could work geostrategically together to balance off an overactive US superpower. So here there are, I think, especially now in this very changing geopolitical environment, China is also looking towards the European Union as a potential counterweight to the United States. We all know that the Trump tariffs were basically aimed at China. And of course, second in line was the European Union, right, which got the real brunt of it. But the United States is looking at ways, whether Democrats or Republicans, looking at ways to balance China. And that is one of the few issues that both sides of the aisle can agree on, that the United States should remain number one, and that China is the closest peer competitor and rival, and we've got to find ways to balance this. Okay, the rest of my notes are really about what it means to be normative power, but that's quite dry academic stuff, so we'll skip that. This is just a quote which kind of illustrates how the how the French had been viewing the Chinese. And there is an interesting book by Alain Perfit, who was a minister in de Gaulle's government, and he quoted Napoleon, who had envisioned, back in the 1800s or late 18th century, that when China awakes, the world will tremble. Right? So there has been, I think, a very long expectation, at least in Paris, that this is going to happen. Okay, this is the century of humiliation we talked about. Okay, so that's all really most of what I wanted to say, that we are now going through a geopolitical shift where the old assumptions might have to be kind of either retired or reassessed. Thinking about the EU as just an economic and normative power, I think is probably something which you in this room probably are more familiar with, and you are probably reassessing. But I think thinking of China as just a military and economic power is also something that needs to be reassessed. And China knows that, because for those of you who are China watchers, you know that China is undergoing a massive change in its society, aside from demographic change where the population has stopped growing, the population has started aging, and like most developed countries in the world, in Europe or in Asia, the fertility rate is way below replacement level, so they will start shrinking. They might start aging before they become a really rich developed country. China's per capita GDP is still much lower than the European Union average, and much lower than the United States. So there are many challenges that they have, and China basically wants to have a kind of a peaceful external environment where it could continue to become richer, more wealthy. And for me, I think it's very, very unlikely that China would do Russia. I mean, invade another country. They might do things that try to buttress their claims to territories that they think are rightfully theirs. But it's, for me, very unlikely that they would rock the boat. The liberal international order, the trading system that was underpinned by the United States for the last 70 years, has worked in China's favor. And I think going forward, we can expect China to want to uphold that liberal trading order. So they will be looking towards the United Kingdom, towards Asian countries, and towards the European Union, among others, to salvage what is left of it. I think there might be a few business people in this room, so I'm not quite sure whether I can answer all your questions and doubts and reservations. And I know there could be a few people who are doubtful about whether China is a normative power at all. I would suggest that when we say normative power, all I mean is China has certain norms which might be a bit different from what the rest of the world, especially the rest of the West, thinks are appropriate norms, and we should be ready to engage China on its own terms. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reuben. This was very interesting. I don't know how should we sit here. Maybe have 2 chairs here so we can sit and have a discussion. Do we have that? Or I can just move this table and we can start. Just so that we are in the middle.
So we stand around the table.
Yeah,
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, I think this was very interesting, and it's of course interesting to have this kind of Asian perspective on both on kind of, I mean, you're in Singapore, how you see China, but also how you kind of see it. You know European Union well, you know the European affairs, so also how you see the development in EU-China relations. And I have 4 questions before I open the floor that I want to challenge you a bit on. We had a discussion yesterday as well, so we continue a bit on this. But the first is, you said that there's one country in Asia that sees the EU also as a kind of geopolitical,
Yes.
or rising geopolitical.
Yes.
But then again, I just wanted to ask you about how does China look at the EU? I mean, does it think of Europe or EU? Because until now, I have seen that from China, I have had an impression that they do not so much see the EU as an actor, but they kind of focus more on individual European countries. So it's a little bit of split and rule approach from the EU. So that's the first question. The other question is, of course, thinking about, I know that when you look at China as a normative power, or you frame it that way,
Yes.
you have different types of norms.
Yes.
And of course, I see that point, but at the same time, sovereignty is one of the key
Yes.
norms. And we know, from a European perspective, China is supporting Russia in kind of and enabling Russia to continue its war in Ukraine. So this is a difficult argument, I think, from a European perspective.
Yes.
So that is the second, and we discussed that yesterday. So, but I get to give you the chance now to comment
Okay.
again. And of course, it's also. You said that it's very unlikely that China will be Russia, kind of an aggressor that's attacking another country. And then, of course, the Taiwan question comes up. So I wanted to say a little bit about that. I mean, it's reassuring that you see it that way, but I wonder, is it really grounded in the development that we see in China these days? And of course, the fourth question is more on global south, where I mean, China is a part of the global south, but also kind of engage in development support in Africa and other countries. And the way they are doing it is a bit different from maybe the European Union and others, and they don't have. I mean, they are focused on development, and development rights was kind of one of the norms.
Yes. Yes.
But then we come back to human rights and the way they do it, which is some, I guess, would criticism. The criticism would be that China is not really a normative actor in Africa. they support the infrastructure, but it's also for kind of preserving Chinese interests.
Yes.
So these are four questions. Sorry,
Okay.
we start with them, and then please sign up, and I let the floor also for the last question.
So should I take the questions first, or
Take
your
start
questions
with
first?
the four, and then I can make a list.
So maybe in order to let everybody have a discussion, I will just be very short in my responses. First question about China's view of the EU or Europe and whether China divides and rules. Yes, of course it does. So does the United States. So does Russia. And you can see in the historical interactions between China and the EU, that at the beginning in the 1970s, when the European communities at the time established relations with China, China didn't quite understand what this animal was. Well, actually, most Europeans, I think, still kind of grapple with what is the EU, especially our British friends. And China kept focusing on the major European capitals. So Berlin, or Bonn at the time, London and Paris. And they couldn't quite understand this animal, which has a bit of a supranational element. For example, whenever there was criticism of China's human rights issues, especially by the European Parliament, they would go instinctively to the European capitals to say, you can't do this, you're embarrassing us, and we've got all these deals at stake. It took a while for them to realize that there is such a thing as Europe, which is more than just the sum of its parts. But they also know that Europe works on intergovernmental principles for things like security and foreign policy, right? And they also realize that in terms of human rights, even if there's a lot of criticism from the European Parliament, it doesn't really affect economic relations. So it took them a while, but then they realized, okay, we'll just have to grin and bear it. Every time a Chinese leader comes to Brussels or to Strasbourg or some of the European capitals, there will be demonstrations in the streets. So I think they've come to accept that. But they've also been quite good at dividing and ruling, and that because when there is a issue that a bilateral issue, say between China and say Lithuania or Latvia, or China and Norway, for example, in the last few years, we had some specific issues. They would try to target their sanctions on that one country, and then it depends on the rest of the European Union. If there is solidarity, you can push back. But very often, there is a lack of solidarity that allows China to take advantage of these differences. So here I think the European Union needs to work together more closely. And now that the UK is out, the UK also needs to work closely with the European Union to have a consistent and coherent China policy. Second question about norms and whether China is enabling Russia in its war with Ukraine. Here, I think we have to be careful. Is China helping Russia to win, or is China just helping Russia not to get completely defeated? My sense, it is closer to B than A. China is helping Russia not to get completely humiliated because China knows if Russia loses and Russia loses badly, then China would be short of one powerful ally in the international system after Ukraine. So in many ways, China is stuck in this position. And yesterday in our podcast, we discussed this. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, was basically taken by surprise. He made a declaration with Putin, something about a no-limits partnership. He didn't know that a war was going to start. Xi Jinping wasn't told, oh, by the way, I'm going to do this incursion, and we're going to capture Kiev within 3 days. I'm sure he would have said, you're really rocking the boat. I don't want this to happen. But it happened. So how is China to react? I think in some ways we have to read the lines carefully. There is no blanket approval of what Russia did, right? And even in some of the votes in the UN, instead of voting against the resolution, sometimes they abstain. So they're not, you see, one of the things I mentioned about was sovereignty. Oops, where did it go? Russia has broken this norm. So how should China, you would expect China should be criticizing Russia. You've broken a very serious norm of sovereignty. So you look at the statements carefully, there is no outright endorsement of Putin's policy. So they are walking a tightrope, and I think, as we discussed yesterday, they are ready to work with the European Union, but they don't know how to get rid of this problem. They just want this problem to go away, right? But they don't know how to get rid of it. They've tried to play a kind of a role as a go-between, as a arbitrator, but I guess nobody in Europe trusts the Chinese enough to play this role. Okay. And thirdly, China is an aggressor. This is very interesting. China is an aggressor. I get this question very often. Do you think China would invade Taiwan? For me, the stakes are too high. The stakes are just too high for China because Taiwan is not just across the border. You don't just send your troops, the way Putin did with Ukraine, and say the military exercises. You have to do an amphibious attack. Taiwan, most of the Chinese military that could possibly take Taiwan are in Fujian province. Fujian province is a province which is shares a similar culture and even a language distinct from Mandarin Chinese with Taiwan. So I think it would be very difficult to absorb Taiwan, and I don't think the Chinese are ready for another Hong Kong. By that I mean, when they took Hong Kong back in 1997, they expected the Hong Kong people to be like, hooray, we're going back to the motherland. What actually happened was people left Hong Kong. They got new passports and new citizenships in Canada, in the United States, in Australia. Singapore offered 50,000 Hong Kong people the right to citizenship in Singapore if they so chose. So they had 2 or 3 citizenships. If China were to take over Taiwan militarily, I think that they would never be forgotten, right? Because when the Kuomintang, which was the nationalist party under Chiang Kai-shek, when they militarily took over Taiwan in 1949, it was remembered in a very negative way by the locals. So absorbing Hong Kong, 6-7 million people is hard enough. Absorbing Taiwan with over 20 million, I think, will be much tougher. And we're not even talking about the reactions from the rest of the world. Fourthly, about the global south and China developing, supporting development in Africa. Yes, China tries to assert or exercise some leadership in the global south. Yes, there have been problems as well. And it's quite interesting when you read some of the reports. Some people in China are asking, why are we giving so much money away? Why aren't we giving more money to our own people? Why aren't we making sure that our young people have better job prospects? So these are domestic issues in China which there are no easy answers to. In fact, when China is coming out of COVID, many people in China were very angry. They were like, what's our government doing? The rest of the world is opening up. We're still stuck in Shanghai. We can't even get food and medicines. And some people see that as also political play, that the rivals of Xi Jinping in China basically came from the Shanghai clique, and he has basically shut them down. It used to be a kind of a round-robin system each clique in the Communist Party takes turns to rule China, but he overturned that. So the people who are more capitalist in China are now being shut down. Another statistic that might be interest you, that China produces about 10 to 12 million graduates a year. 10 to 12 million. Where are these people going to find jobs? They won't be able to find jobs. So, like in other countries in Asia, some of them will have to end up being taxi drivers. And so you will have this problem of a middle class which feels that the best days of China are behind us. My parents benefited from them, but I've got to look for another job. I've got to look for another degree. So that's why many young Chinese citizens, and many of whom come from one-child families, their families are willing to spend lots of money on them to send them abroad and never come back. So that's, you might have met some of these people in Norway, young Chinese, very ambitious, who feel that there's no future for me back in China. So there are all these issues that China is grappling with, and for me, these are reasons why it's unlikely that China will rock the boat and do Ukraine or Taiwan.
Okay, we have Olav Stenstokke first.
Thank you. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I have one conceptual question and one empirical. The conceptual one revolves around this notion of a normative power. Yes. My question is, are you not diluting that concept, since that concept is usually applied to actors who are prepared to do things that are inconvenient and costly to protect the norm? Whereas all the norms that you list that China champions are all rather convenient ones for China. So that's the issue, whether you're not diluting the notion of a normative power. The empirical one is, the cases that you present, do they really support the notion that the geopolitical thinking goes on in Europe and not in China? I mean, the way you laid out the perception in China of the EU is clearly casted in geopolitical terms. The kind of norms that China is now clearly among the key champions of in the free trade area today is also it's not an inconvenient norm. It's a convenient one.
Okay.
And well, you mentioned yourself the kind of the difficulties or at least tensions between the second norm you mentioned of non-interference and Russia and China's overall stance in the Ukraine issue. So in other words, are you conceptually diluting the notion, and empirically are you exaggerating the normative component of China's behavior?
Yes, I think the first question, yes, I am diluting the understanding of normative power, and I think quite justifiably, because the key proponent of normative power, Ian Manners, he basically had a one case kind of example. It was really the death penalty, capital punishment, and that's a norm which I agree the European Union and most European countries support the abolition of the death penalty, and they will go to extents which hurt them economically in order to do so. For example, the European Union is willing to campaign against the death penalty for people on death row in Japan and the United States. There's no way that this benefits the EU. In fact, it hurts their economic interests. So in that sense, yes, the EU is a normative power because it supports and sticks its neck out for norms which actually hurt its own interests. But in many other ways, you can, because aside from death penalty, I find it very hard to find any other norms which the EU stands for, which it's willing to sacrifice tangible, pragmatic interests for. For example, human rights, right? Human rights are the rights of ethnic minorities to have their own language, their own education system, to protect their culture. I find NGOs much more active in this front, whether in Europe or the United States. Human Rights Watch, for example, Amnesty International, who are willing to do that. And of course, the European Parliament does that. But the member states in the European Union, well, they make statements, but they will sign the agreement. And they do this with China. They did that with Russia in the past. The only countries that they were consistently taking a stand on would be countries like Myanmar, where the economic interest stakes are not so high. So there, I think the double standards are quite apparent.
But if we agree that the EU is not a normative power, I mean, I think that is, if I understand you correctly, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we can agree that maybe there are not so many powers that are normative power. I think the challenge that I have, and maybe, I don't know if that's the same challenge you have, all of the, how can you say that China is a normative power based on these kind of alternative norms? Maybe there is another, maybe the concept is not the right one. Maybe you should use another concept. I don't know if that was...
There was a suggestion by some of your colleagues at Arena yesterday.
Yeah, we had this discussion yesterday.
They said, don't use normative power, use a concept like, I can't remember. Second generation rights promoter, something.
Yeah,
like that.
the different concepts, and you could also it could also be some kind of soft power in China, but it's not really that either.
Yeah.
Not with these. But maybe the normative power is not. It might be difficult to use both for the EU for the reasons that you mentioned, but also for kind of describing China.
But I guess, when you talk about normative power, which is mainly accepted in Europe, whether by policymakers or students or scholars of the European Union, it doesn't cut much ice in Asia. Most Asians do not see the European Union as a normative power. And that in the surveys done in the last 20 years by Chaban and Holland, most of them see Europe is a very pragmatic economic power. It does things for its own economic interests. So one of the critiques of this whole normative power concept is your interlocutor, is the person that you're dealing with, do they see you as a normative power? And if that is the yardstick, I'm afraid in most Asian countries the answer is no. They don't see the EU as normative power. They might see the EU as an attractive place for investment, attractive place for tourism and to attract tourists, but not as a model, So there could be attractions for China, for example, to look at the social model in Europe, especially in the Nordic states, and say, this is closer to what we are already doing, and if we go on the road to more capitalism, this could be how we could end up. We won't go the American way for sure.
I think Ola wants to come in again, just as
very briefly.
Yes.
After all, the thrust of your talk was not on Europe and whether or not it's a normative power, but on the China, an argument in favor of the thesis that China is a normative power.
Yeah.
So that's, and
I think you're right.
I sincerely doubt that the argument that you made is convincing empirically.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we take another question. I have back here. Yeah, I think it's.
Hi, I'm Henrik Wiig, economist from Oslo New University College. We see now when there is Trump is dismantling international trade, that many people, as you suggest, actually look at China as a potential partner in keeping on international trade. And you also said that China might look at us as a potential partner. But in this partnership, there is also problems because it might end up with we being quite weak, as you touched upon. Norway had a dispute over a political Peace Nobel's Prize, and we were punished by 10 years of not being able to export to you. I doubt that we will ever again give a Nobel's Prize to any opponents in China again. And I'm actually studying Africa and Latin America. I see they open up for Chinese investments and not realizing how weak they will actually become. And you, in some sense, gave a response that, oh, what else could you expect? We are good at actually split and conquer. So why didn't you join up in EU? Why didn't you give a response as Europe as such? I can't see that happening, a joint response from Latin America. I can't see that happening in Africa. So it leaves me quite pessimistic in the sense that if you really start trading with you, you are quite weak. Or you, say, the Chinese, and you will be vulnerable for political pressure.
So you think this is the case not only for the weaker countries in Africa or Asia, but also for the European Union?
Yeah, that's what you said, that we had a problem, Latvia had a problem, because EU didn't respond on behalf of us. So what else can you expect? It's a very weak, small partner and a huge country, and of course they will smash you if you don't do something we don't disagree on.
I think historically the European Union has actually acted very well on trade, and we're very strong partners. I mean, you think about the Uruguay round in the 1990s, how the European Union was able to champion, even the preferences of one country. For example, in 1995, France insisted on cultural exception. If you had done this research, they said, we want to limit American Hollywood influence in Europe. Specifically, it was actually for France, which they're still doing, but they wanted to magnify it to the European level, and they succeeded. I can't see any other grouping of countries in the world, certainly not where I come from. ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Association of Nations, is very weak when it comes to pressure by China. But the European Union was able to stand up to the United States on the cultural exception argument for the WTO. And the European Union now has many decisions to make going forward, because the European Union has put limits on electric vehicles. And yesterday I was talking with Pernilla, was it because of competition, or was it because of fears about spying by the Chinese? It could be both, but the European Union has tools which many other groupings of countries don't have. It has that economy of scale, which the Chinese respect. So my sense is that, even back in the 1990s, when China was trying to get out of the Tiananmen, you remember 1989, when Eastern European countries transitioned and all the communist regimes fell, China didn't transition, but it had a crackdown, right? 1989 crackdown. And then there were sanctions by European Union countries. The Chinese were trying very hard to break out of the sanctions policy. And the European Union, if it had held together, it could have, I think, pressured the Chinese a lot more. But of course, there was competition between the European Union and the United States to start dismantling the sanctions so that they could trade with China. So I find that the historical record of the European Union standing together on trade to be much stronger than most people give it credit for, and it should continue. Just last year or 2 years ago, von der Leyen and Macron made a joint visit to China. And it was very interesting because one was the good cop and one was the bad cop. No prizes for guessing who. And the Chinese were extremely funny, I think, in the response. They basically treated von der Leyen very shabbily. They wanted to make a statement that we don't like what you're saying. This is not the Europe we want. And they gave Macron royal treatment. Xi Jinping brought him to a very personal space in, I think it was Guangzhou in Canton province. And that was a way of saying, we like this Europe, we don't like that Europe. But at the end of the day, they still have to deal with von der Leyen. So what was she? She had all the things. She said all the things that the Chinese didn't want to hear. I can't remember what it was. Something about not outsourcing.
De-risking.
De-risking. Whole speech about de-risking, and but I think it worked. Because the Chinese realized that we can't continue business as usual while we have all these restrictions on trade, and there will be political impediments as long as the war in Ukraine is continuing. So they knew that there would be. So I think in that sense, Europe is better at playing this game now. It used to be Chinese coming to divide and rule, but the Europeans can also do that with China. You want the friendly Europe or you want the nasty Europe? And I think von der Leyen did a very good job, if my personal opinion.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, so I think we take 2 by 2 now. So it's you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Toralf Stenvold, former Norwegian diplomat to China, EU and the WTO. I have one question split in 2 parts. Now, the UN Charter and the Covenant of Human Rights were established while China was represented by the Kuomintang,
Yes,
not by the People's Republic.
that's right.
The WTO was established in 1995. China was not a member. They joined in 2001.
Yes.
The question is, how does this influence China's view and respect for these international instruments? Secondly, do you think China will be prepared to bring the WTO rules in conjunction with UN norms, including human rights?
We take one more, so...
It was already answered, my question.
Yeah, okay, good. And then you can, we can take your answer.
Trump has a point, and European right-wing leaders have a point. China's becoming the workshop of the world.
Yes.
And what the globalization means, they're taking jobs from American and European middle-class, working-class voters.
Yes.
That's a serious concern. Do you think this tariffs is going to go on forever? Is this a solution, or how is the economic world going to evolve in that context?
Okay. So maybe I'll take the second question first. Trump's argument, right? Trump's argument that China is taking away jobs from working class Americans. It's similar, I think, to the arguments that globalization was bad for the UK, right? Hence Brexit, and it has some purchase in many Western countries, but it's not just China. These jobs would have gone anyway. If they hadn't gone to China, they would have gone to Vietnam, to Bangladesh. You look at clothes by Zara, one of the biggest textile manufacturers in Europe. Hardly anything is made in Europe, except for maybe Portugal or and then the rest of it is Morocco and the rest of the world. So it's also I guess a cost. You go to places which are cheaper, and hence what Trump is trying to do, it's, for me, it doesn't make economic or political sense. How can you force Apple to move everything back to the United States? Mm-hmm. Apple will not be able to sell its products at that cost anymore. Taking jobs away from working class people, I think it's a very good political ploy. Because it convinces people that there is a simple solution, a very simple, and there is a simple bad guy to point your finger at, but it doesn't help you to make your industries more efficient. How would China react? China is already responding by trying to spur domestic consumption, right? So for the last 40 or 50 years, since the Deng Xiaoping reforms, China has focused on selling outside. But now that China has reached kind of lower middle income status, it really has a large domestic market. And now, finally, the government under Xi Jinping has started stimulus measures. This is a huge market that can't be underestimated. So they might not have the spending power to compensate for the loss of Western markets, but they are able to now start stimulating the domestic economy. And I think it will go a long way towards making up for the loss in revenue selling to the United States. The Chinese government realizes that this is a very, very untapped market. But one of the major problems still is confidence. Consumer confidence in China is not high. So, what I mentioned earlier on, many of the more educated, more affluent Chinese families are sending their children abroad and telling them, please don't come back. Try to get citizenship somewhere else. Which is, I think, very sad for them, because many of their families could actually have Communist Party backgrounds, but they're not confident that this party is able to continue leading this country on a stable keel for the next few decades. So yes, I think I'm actually basically waiting, but the economists in this room would know better. I'm basically waiting for the American voter to realize that whatever Trump promised is not going to work, and then they're going to have find ways to get rid of him, just like they did in 2020. Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions about WTO and the UN. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Chinese tend to say, oh, we weren't there at the beginning. We didn't agree to these rules. And it's the same for the UN Charter, the same for the UDHR, because it was basically Taiwan in the Security Council. But when they joined, I think this is what we have to remind them, when they joined the UN, I think it was 79, and then the WTO, they signed on to these agreements that were already in place. So we need to remind them. And of course, China is an even more face-conscious society than the United States. So the best way to remind them is actually to do it out of the public eye. Yeah.
Can I just follow? Yeah. Now, the difference between the UN accession and WTO accession is the latter spent 15 years to negotiate entry. I suppose they didn't do that for the UN.
Yes, so the UN, it was Kissingerian diplomacy, and it was convenient to replace the seat from Taipei to Beijing. Looking back, and I did some research on Taiwan. Sometimes Taiwanese diplomats feel they made a mistake. At that point, they should have said, "All right, one seat for China, one seat for Taiwan." So they missed the golden opportunity. They were so fixated on this one China idea. But yes, I think eventually the international community will have to remind China, these are your commitments, and let's stick to them.
Okay, we have more questions. So,
thank you. I'm Sadia, I'm Pakistan's ambassador to Norway. And thank you indeed for a very insightful lecture. My question is about the recently established International Organization of Mediation headquartered in Hong Kong. I would like to hear from you your take on that in the context of the three norms which China is promoting according to your lecture.
International
Organization for Mediation that is recently established in Hong Kong, and I think 33 countries, according to media reports, signed it, but Pakistan for sure, and Serbia from Europe also. perhaps ostensibly because of its unhappiness with NATO, maybe. Yeah, I would like to hear your take on that.
I'm afraid I'm not so familiar with this organization, but I think if you, the general principle is you look at the last 10 or 15 years of China's activity in building up or founding organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, SCO, as well as some of the other more financial, economic ones. They tend to do it a bit differently for the United States. They sometimes headquarter them. In fact, most of them have been headquartered outside of Beijing, right? They pick Shanghai, they pick Hong Kong in this case, and for me, most of these are economically based, because China wants to make sure that its access to markets and resources and are kept open. So I think you can expect some political interference or political intervention by Beijing, but more or less, I find that Chinese involvement in international organizations tend to be economically centered, and that they are willing to do business.
Yeah, its name is mediation, by the way, but we have seen China's role in near past, like mediation between, or you're developing a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia as well. So I think, yeah, this is also as a maybe fourth norm, which
add something here. Thank you. Mediation. Okay.
Marianne.
Yeah, thank you. Hi again,
Yes,
we met
hi, Maria.
yesterday as well. I have a couple of questions. First, I was wondering the multilateral order institutions, and not necessarily then taking into account the human rights conventions, because that's another discussion. But I mean, if you look at the international system, the trade system, the monetary system, etc., China has of course gained a lot from joining that. But now Trump is doing his utmost to undermine the system. But how do you see China's perspective on this, like in general? Does China have an interest in trying to uphold this system, for example, together with the EU, or is China more looking for regional cooperations and partners? And I have another question, if I may, that is linked to Ukraine and peace negotiations. And many tend to assume that China would need to perhaps get involved at some point. That would be one thing that might push negotiations further. So what do you think it would take for China to somehow get involved and pressure Russia more? With strong secondary sanctions, for example, would that affect China's position?
Okay, so I think the first question about the multilateral order, especially in terms of trade and finance, I think your question was about whether China would uphold the rules? Yeah, I think the Chinese response to what Trump is doing is also very interesting. They are hedging, right? So China is now the largest holder of U.S. debt, and they are probably afraid that the debt they're holding might not be worth very much if Trump continues in this way. You can see that even before Trump, they were beginning to reduce their holdings in U.S. dollars. I know they were interested in the euro, and they are still very interested in the euro right from the beginning. So you can see that China would hedge its bets on that. Ukraine and the peace negotiations, I think, is really the trickiest. I have no idea how. I don't think the Chinese can be incentivized to put pressure on Russia. Yeah, I think they will go along with Russia as long as it doesn't hurt their interests. I think the moment it hurts the interest, let's say it leads to a reduced access to European markets, or it leads to sanctions not just on Russia, but sanctions on China, I think that's when the Chinese would respond. But I don't know how the Europeans can do it in a way which, of course, it will be threatening, but it cannot be seen by the Chinese public as buckling to EU or US pressure. So it's a difficult balance. So maybe von der Leyen might have to do her thing again, but to do it in a quieter diplomatic way, to say, you know, we're thinking of doing this, and I'm under a lot of pressure from my member states, because, you know, what you're doing is so offensive, not just to the member states, but to general public opinion. I think if she were to do this, there is a chance that the Chinese will realize we cannot play the game on both sides now. We've got to take sides, and our interests are more with Europe than with Russia.
I have many on my list, so yeah, now it's your turn, actually.
But the lady is waiting.
No, you are on the list.
All right, thank you. My name is Susanna Sabo, and thank you for the fascinating presentation. My question would be, when it comes to the European market, what is the Chinese vision or strategy when it comes to the EV and the battery sector? I'm sorry, but I needed to ask.
Strategy for EV. Okay.
Especially when Tesla is backsliding, so it seems to be a golden opportunity for China.
Yeah, I guess it was only in the last 3 or 4 years that I realized that this EV market was such a big thing. Before that, I kept thinking, you know, Tesla must be the market leader. And then I realized I was seeing lots of Chinese EVs on the road in Singapore. And I was like, this can't be. I'm sure it's bad quality, you know. And then I started doing research and reading, and I realized that the Chinese are the leaders now. And I didn't realize that. So last year I went to Berlin, and I went to speak to the former German ambassador to Singapore, and I said, you know, what's happening in all this debate? You know, why so much sensitivity over EVs? And of course, he basically told me what we discussed yesterday, that it's security and all these issues. But I was telling him, you know, in the long run, if China is the market leader, then it's your interest to work with them, right? And your interest to, since they have the most efficient batteries and they have the best EVs on the market, then do joint projects. I went to also look at the EV market sales in China, and the discerning Chinese consumer likes to buy BMW EVs, but there aren't enough of them, you know. So there is a market in China itself for European EVs, and I couldn't understand why there was all this debate. So one report I read, I think it was Mercator, and this was before von der Leyen's Mercator speech, suggested that, okay, maybe it wasn't Mercator, it was the former Spanish foreign minister, I can't remember her name, Sanchez something. She came to Singapore, and I met her, and I said, tell me what you think about this EV debate. And okay, actually that was supposed to be Chatham House rules. But anyway, basically I realized that there were many different voices in the European Union, and some voices were saying, we need to work with the Chinese, and you know, in the long term, this is the technology that we need to invest in. So I think it's really the political impediments that are stopping European car manufacturers, and maybe a little bit of protectionism. But you know, with the thirst for luxury goods in China, whether they are the traditional luxury goods by LVMH, for example, or better made cars, I think the European manufacturers are really missing the boat if they don't get into that market, because there is a demand for it.
It's the security
Issue, yeah.
Okay, we have more on the list, so I come back to you in the end. But yeah.
Yeah, Rolf Hansen, I'm a former diplomat. I was interested to hear your estimate on Hong Kong being so difficult to deal with, that might affect the Chinese behavior in relation to Taiwan.
Yes.
But on Hong Kong, do you see the Chinese sort of reversing the policies or trying to deal with it in different ways rather than just clamping down on everything right now? And the other thing was just a point of information. I think the mediation organization that was mentioned, I don't know a lot about it, but I think it's about commercial conflicts to deal with that, which makes sense in relation to Hong Kong, I think. Yeah, thank you.
I think we'll take one more just so that we
Thank you very much. My name is Hannah Weber and I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford and currently visiting research fellow at UP.
At Oxford, okay.
Yes. And I very much have to agree with Ulla's earlier criticism of the kind of like conceptual underpinnings you're trying to use. Nonetheless, I have to say that I do think you're onto something very interesting here, like the kind of underlying dynamic you're trying to capture. But I do think it might benefit maybe also from looking less so at the specific norms, but more so at the like arenas or spheres where those norms are being kind of contested or negotiated in the first place. So one thing that I want to know whether you've looked at it at all is actually the digital domain, because digital sovereignty is something very vividly discussed both by China and the EU. I think it's a very, very interesting example where it might be perhaps a bit easier even to kind of trace this development that I think you're trying to get to. It's a very interesting book by Anna Bradford. It's called Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And she actually describes this like digital empire of China being market-driven, being state-driven or state-centric, and the European one being regulatory and rights-centric. But I think the interesting point is that the understanding of digital sovereignty in the first place is something more so originating from China. But Europe has very much kind of adopted it and reappropriated it into one of its key foreign policy ambitions. So I think it's an interesting thing to go into, maybe about like using similar words or paradigms, but actually attaching slightly different aims to it, and how that shapes the relationship. Yeah.
We definitely should exchange notes after this, because I've not looked at this at all. I didn't realize that the European Union was following norms that China is taking lead in this area. But thank you very much. It's a great suggestion. Yeah.
Hong Kong issue.
Oh, Hong Kong issue. I think I was actually amazed the last few times I went to Hong Kong, how much people, Hong Kong-born people, felt a sense of antipathy towards Beijing. Yeah, and I think it's growing. Yeah, so I don't blame them. I mean, in a sense, Singapore is lucky. We're also former British colony, mainly ethnic Chinese, also from two provinces in China, Fujian and Guangdong. But we have, I guess, the luck, as it were, of being a little bit further away from China and having never been part of China. So we are able to become an independent country. I don't think the Chinese will let Hong Kong go its own way. They cannot. It is too much of a political risk for them to have one territory being so much more autonomous than the rest of the country. And they also have no real interest in letting Hong Kong go back to its pre-1997 heyday, because they want to show that, you know, if a city or if a region in China succeeds, it's under the communist system. It's not because of the pre-communist, the British DNA that's in Hong Kong. it's because we've succeeded on our own terms, and that's why they are more interested in making sure Hangzhou, Suzhou, Shanghai succeeds. So I don't think there's a rosy picture for people in Hong Kong. They will have to accept that the rules in Beijing are coming to Hong Kong, have already come, and are going to be executed in a tough way. We saw that in the black shirt movements in 2019. And the way the Chinese media portrayed the demonstrations was something which most mainland Chinese agreed with, that these were hoodlums and these were gangsters, and they weren't doing things which were patriotic, right? And you'll see even influencers in Hong Kong, Hong Kong born, Hong Kong bred. Probably the most famous one would be Jackie Chan, right? The Kung Fu star, who's made statements saying we need to support Beijing and the Chinese line. So I really think that the Chinese are actually accelerating this process of cynicizing China much faster than the original 50 years that we had actually expected in 97. Yeah.
We have two more questions, so in the back.
Thank you. My name is Richard. I'm policy advisor at Amnesty International.
Okay.
So you can understand why I'll go back to the norms, China's position as normative power. I have this question on whether China is seeking to change the norms, the global norms that we've been governed by for decades now. Because I understand why in Europe there's the reluctance to see China as a rising, if not a normative power. But look at Africa. And in 2017, Beijing Declaration on Human Rights, where they actually saw development and subsistence as the basic human rights compared to civil political rights.
Yes.
And then you also look at the professionalization trainings that Beijing is giving to Africans, politicians,
yes,
and journalists, all training them in its kind of policy of development trumps or models,
yes,
and offering them as alternatives, prototypes compared to democracy and to get out of poverty. So my question to you is, do you really think Beijing seeks to change the order with regards to press freedom, democracy, democratic value, and development, which they have actually taken the lead in promoting, being an activist for right to development? Is Beijing seeking to change that order?
I don't see this as Beijing trying to change the order. I see this as Beijing trying to make the international environment more comfortable for itself. Because Beijing doesn't want to change, right? Beijing doesn't want to become more like Hong Kong. Right? Beijing wants to remain authoritarian. It wants to keep the primacy of the Communist Party. So it does all these things on the international stage, in this case Africa, not out of altruism, but of course, first of all, economic interest, but also to show that its way of development has got purchased elsewhere, right? And it's probably doing a better job of this in Africa than in Asia. I say this because Beijing doesn't have territorial disputes in Africa. It has plenty in Asia, right? So whatever it does in Asia, there will be countries that are open to Beijing and would accept whatever Beijing gives. But there are other countries who would desist and say, you know, what are the strings attached? And of course, the more powerful, economically independent countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, would be able to say, hey, we're not taking this because we know that you have certain conditions. So thank you very much, but we'll not take that aid. And I think, you know, some of the research even in African countries, show that there are other strings attached. Yes, there are no political conditionalities compared to, say, aid from the United States and Europe, but there are loans which are tied up to all kinds of issues, and then paying the loans will be difficult. So some African countries are getting into debt with Beijing. So they have to be careful. But what is interesting too is some of the lobbies in specific countries in Africa are using the aid from Beijing to push for transparency. Believe it or not, push for transparency against their own governments to say that, the aid is coming from Beijing. Now be accountable. Where's that aid going? Is it going to the pockets of the leaders or not? And one research done by a young Chinese scholar was, this happens in Africa, but it doesn't happen back home, right? So there are no questions being asked in China about where's the aid going and where's the money going. And I'm not sure whether it will come back to China, but it's interesting that China, an authoritarian country and a communist one, is promoting some of the norms that NGOs and Western countries like, accountability and proper channels of disbursement of aid, and for me, it's counterintuitive.
Okay. Last question from here.
Absolutely. I apologize for taking the floor a second time. To the treasuries. Now, if I had stocks in treasuries and I was expecting them to fall, I might consider selling. Do you think China is thinking along these lines, and what will be the consequence? Secondly, on Ukraine.
Yes.
If you had to choose partnership between Russia and the European Union, and I think maybe China would drop Russia and go for you. What do you think?
Okay, I think the second question, yes, eventually China, for its own self-interest, would drop Russia. But I'm not quite sure what the conditions would be. I think there probably would need to be some political change in Russia first for the Chinese to decide, we've had enough of Putin taking us on this wild adventure. We want to get off this ride. Treasuries to sell or not? The Chinese have started selling. So if you believe that the Chinese have got it right, maybe you should start selling some as well. I am still holding on to some because I don't think it's going to be so fast that the U.S. treasuries are going to be worthless. But and the Singapore government is still quite confident that the U.S. is able to remake itself. So I guess if we look at the long term, post-Trump, hopefully there will be a more stable and saner government in power in Washington. And maybe look at the midterm elections in the U.S. If people start voting with their heads this time, then maybe it's time to buy more treasuries again.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we need to end here, but I want to come back to the title of the seminar. And I feel like when we have discussed this, you actually present China as a very interest-based actor. So I would challenge you maybe, because I know that this will be a paper, so maybe normative power, China as a normative power is not the good concept. Okay. But I agree with you have had some suggestions here today and also yesterday in our seminar, and it has been really interesting having this perspective from you for kind of being in the region and of course looking at China in a different way that we see it here. We should have talked even more about EU-China relations. In the end, this is a seminar in a series on the EU-China relations is important. I think it was a good question here, which if you have to choose between Russia and the EU, what will China choose? And if it was kind of more on a normative power, it would have been, and sovereignty is an important norm, and non-interference. One would perhaps assume that China would choose the EU and support the EU
Yes.
supporting the EU in their support for Ukraine against Russia.
Yes, yes.
So that would be an argument that goes a bit against the normative power.
That's true.
Okay, thank you so much for this seminar, and thank you for coming, and thank you for a lot of good questions. And thanks to you, Reuben. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah.